Hello, my name's Tony Robinson, and I'm here with my Romans Podcast Miniseries. And in this one, what we want to look at is what does under law mean? And specifically, we want to look at one of the opinions of the scholars who says that under law means under a covenant of works. Under law means under a covenant of works. And so we want to see what that means. So Romans 6:14 is our verse under consideration. For sin shall not have dominion over you, for you are not under the law, but under grace. And we want to try to figure out what does the phrase under law mean? I've talked about this before. There really are no scholarly, there is no scholarly consensus on the proper interpretation. There are many interpretations. As I said, I'm going to give you 8, and all 8 are divergent. Meaning they're not the same, so obviously some of them are wrong. But however, most interpretations do converge to mean that we're no longer under the law of Moses as a standard of righteous behavior. So we want to look at those, and we're going to explore this. So let's look at a specific ones. Some scholars, they read Paul as saying, for you are not under a covenant of works, is what they call it, but under grace. So we want to look at that and see if there's any truth to that. So what do we mean by a covenant of works? Well, Charles Hodge is a scholar that promoted this view. He said that to be under law is to be under the obligation to fulfill the law of God as a rule of duty, as a condition of salvation. So that is a quote from him. So basically, if you're under law, that means you have to fulfill the whole law as a condition of salvation. Here's a quote from him: from the whole doctrine of redemption, which teaches that the law from which we are delivered by the death of Christ is not simply the Mosaic law. Let me keep reading. Is not simply the Mosaic law. We are not merely delivered from Judaism, but from the obligation of fulfilling the law of God as a condition of salvation. So that's what he thinks under law means. And as you can see, he doesn't believe that it means we're delivered from the law of Moses as a standard of righteousness. That's not what he's arguing. What he's arguing is that we are delivered from having to keep it 100% as an obligation, as a condition for salvation. So we want to look at that. And here are a couple of more. Here's another quote from Charles Hodge. He said, to be under the law is to be under the obligation to fulfill the law of God as a rule of duty, as the condition of salvation. Whoever is under the law is, in this sense, is under the curse. For the law says, cursed is everyone who continues not in all the things written in the book of the law. And he gets that from Galatians chapter 3. Furthermore, in Romans 7:1-6, Hodge argues that believers are dead to the law's commands, interpreting it as meaning that believers have died to the law as a covenant of works. Okay? He also says that it was not intended to give life, but to prepare men to receive Christ as the only source of righteousness and salvation. So before I get into the reasons why a covenant of works, as he has defined it, is not what under law means, I just want to cover a couple of points here. So he says it was not intended for life. He says the law was not intended for life. Well, that is in direct contradiction to Paul, because Paul says the opposite in Romans 7, chapter 7, verse 10. He says, and the commandment which was to bring life, I found to bring death. Okay. Now we have to remember the context that Paul is speaking in. He's speaking of before his regeneration, that instead of the commandment bringing him life, it brought him death. Okay. And so, but the point I want to make is that Paul tells us that the commandment was to bring life, despite the fact that Charles Hodges says that it didn't bring life. And furthermore, the reason why we know that it was intended for the Israelites to have life. It was intended for them to live a long and prosperous and abundant life. Leviticus 18:5, which is a very important scripture in this topic matter here, says, "You shall therefore keep my statutes and my judgments, which if a man does, he shall live by them. I am Adonai." Now that's the New King James Version, and as I've said before, it's really not the best translation. And so the New International Translation, the New English Translation, I believe, NET. It says, "So you must keep my statutes and my regulations. Anyone who does so will live by keeping them. I am the Lord." So that's really the primary reading. When you read it as, "which if a man does, he shall live by them or in them," that is a very wooden translation of the Hebrew. The bait, the bait that comes before the word judgments is more of an instrumental bait. It's the means by which you attain life. Okay. So anyway, there are other better translations, but it's basically saying that if you keep the commandments, you're going to live a long life. And remember, that's what Moses was trying to impress upon the children of Israel on the banks of on the banks of the Jordan, while they were on the plains of Moab before they left. He said this multiple times throughout Deuteronomy: obey the commandments so that you may live, see your children's children, etc., etc. Another thing I want to say about Leviticus 18:5, you must keep my statutes. Anyone who does so will live by keeping them, is how Paul refers to it in Romans 10:5. Paul says, "For Moses writes about the righteousness which is of the law. The man who does those things shall live by them." Now, when he says the righteousness, it's really as if he's saying the quote unquote righteousness. In other words, he's saying this is the benefit of keeping the law. Moses writes about the benefit, the righteousness which is of the law. The man who does these things shall what? Live a long life through them. So, according to Paul, Moses doesn't say the righteousness of the law has anything to do with keeping it 100%. So that's kind of the first point we want to make right there. That it has nothing to do with keeping it 100% as a condition of salvation. You will search in vain in the Tanakh, the Old Testament, for any type of statement like that. So, according to Paul, Moses says that keeping it will ensure you have a long and prosperous physical life, and life more abundant, I may add. Other proponents of the reading include David Brown, who says this: "To be under the law, then, is first to be under its claim to entire obedience on pain of death." And again, that's similar to Charles Hodges. And so, secondly, to underlie the curse of the law as having violated its righteous demands, Galatians 3:10. Again, there's a close association with this covenant of works theology with Galatians 3:10. And since any power to fulfill the law can reach the sinner only through grace, of which the law knows nothing. Okay, so here you have his worldview, what he thinks about the law. You see, he says that the law knows nothing about grace. All right. It follows lastly that to be under the law is to be shut up under an inability to keep it, and consequently to be the helpless slave of sin. Okay. And so that's what he's saying. So I want to say one thing about this comment he made concerning grace when he said, "of which the law knows nothing." I want to take you back to Romans 5:20-21, which says, "Moreover, the law entered that the offense may abound." And what I want to do is I want to tell you that this statement that he made of grace, of which the law knows nothing, is in direct contradiction to what Paul stated. The context of Romans 5:20-21 is in direct contradiction to his statement about grace, because the grace of God needed to overcome the law's sin-provoking role. Remember, moreover, the law entered that the offense might abound. So Paul's telling you, hey, the law entered that the offense might abound. But the grace needed to overcome that sin-provoking role of the law. That grace came during the exact same time period of the law. As a matter of fact, as soon as the law was given, that grace was there for the Old Testament saints. All we need to do is look at the context of Romans 5:20-21. It says, moreover, the law entered that the offense might abound. So we're talking about Exodus chapter 19. We're talking about Moses giving the law when he originally gave the law to the children of Israel. And what happened at the exact same time? He says, but where sin abounded, why was sin abounding? Because Paul just told us the law entered so that the offense might abound. So, but where sin abounded, grace abounded more. So this idea that Mr. Brown has just espoused, that the law knows nothing of grace, to the contraire, mon frère. What Paul says is that when the law entered so that the offense might abound, at that same time that happened, grace also abounded. So again, when we read through and try to understand some of the reasoning of the scholars, there are many ways in which they are contradicting what the scriptures are saying. So under law, does it mean under a covenant of works? Here we go. We're going to look at three reasons here. Reason number one, well, if you believe that the law was given so that you had to keep it 100%, and if you didn't keep it 100%, then that was a condition of salvation, that would imply that Israel was under a covenant of works, as they call it. But this simply cannot be sustained from the Tanakh nor the apostolic writings, okay? Because, why? Because neither the Old Testament nor the New Testament teaches that man was obligated to fulfill the law of God as a condition of salvation, right? There's nowhere in the Old Testament or the New Testament that you are going to read where a condition of salvation was that you kept the law 100%. As a matter of fact, this is what Romans chapters 1-4 is all about, okay? And telling you, trying to teach you that that salvation is not obtained by keeping the law 100%. Okay, that's the whole point of Romans 1-8, especially Romans 1-4. Genesis 15:6, that quintessential verse in the Tanakh that teaches us what faith is. He says, and he believed the Lord and he counted it to him as righteousness. In other words, in Romans chapter 4, Paul argues that that everyone, even the Old Testament saints, we're all justified by faith. And he points to Genesis 15:6, that all-important verse, to teach us that, hey, salvation, the impartation of God's righteousness to someone, is by faith, has always been by faith, and will always be by faith. Paul also quotes Habakkuk 2:4. I think it's in the book of Galatians that he does this. He says, behold, the proud, his soul is not upright in him, but what? The just shall live by his faith. And then lastly, right here, says, but now the righteousness of God apart from the law is revealed. This is Romans chapter 3, verse 21-23. Now the righteousness of God apart from the law is revealed, being witnessed by the law and the prophets, even the righteousness of God through faith in Yeshua Messiah to all who believe. For there's no difference. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. So what Paul is saying here is that this idea of righteousness through faith It is in the Tanakh, in the Old Testament, and in the New Testament. And he says it's witnessed by the Old Testament. In other words, when you go back to the Tanakh and you ask the question, how is salvation granted? How is someone counted as righteous before God? His answer is that the Tanakh said that you are accounted righteous by God because of your faith. It was never a condition of or a covenant of works. Here's reason number 2. This is a very good reason. The local context, and when I say local context, I mean Romans chapter 5 through 8. In other words, Romans chapter 6 verse 14, the verse that we're looking at so in-depthly, it is within the context of Romans 5 through 8. But the local context of Paul's discourse never mentions that covenant of works reading. It never mentions any of those things that David Brown or Charles Hodges mentioned. Paul's arguments throughout Romans 5 to 8 is not oriented towards the problem of works righteousness. It's just not. There's nothing about works righteousness in Romans 5 through 8. But his arguments are leaning toward or oriented towards the reign of sin, Romans 5:12 through 19, the role of the law in the intensification of transgression, Romans 5:20 through 21, and chapter 7, verses 7 through 13, and the proper behavior for those who have been delivered from the reign of sin. That's Romans 6:1 through 23, and Romans 8:1 through 14. That takes care of all of Romans 5 through 8. There is not one word there's not one word about the covenant of works and how you have to keep the law 100% in order for salvation. You would think that under law in Romans 6:14, you would think that if it meant any of those things, that somewhere within the context of Romans chapter 5 through chapter 8, Paul would mention it. That's a big clue for us that this idea of covenant of works, that is not the proper translation of under law or under the law. Paul's arguments about works righteousness are found in Romans 1 through 4. So you guys can check that out. Go read Romans 1 through 4, especially chapters 3 through 4. In Romans 3 through 4, that's where Paul talks so much about the works of the law, okay? And doing works of the law. And his argument is the opposite of what David Brown and what Charles Hodges say. His arguments are the complete opposite. In Romans 5 through 8, Paul never talks about how we have to keep the law 100% as a condition of salvation. He also never mentions anything about a covenant of works that either explicitly or implicitly. So that's your first clue right there that the phrase under law has nothing to do with a covenant of works as it has been described by Hodges and Brown. Now, this is from David Brown. He says, it follows lastly that to be under the law is to be shut up under an inability to keep it, and consequently to be the helpless slave of sin. So this is how he says the law, this is how he determines that sin has dominion over us. He says that to be under it is to be under the inability to keep it. Okay. Now, again, this is what we need to ask. He's saying that to be under the law is to be shut up under an inability to keep it. Okay. Well, this is so simple. All we need to do. The question we need to ask is this: where in Paul's arguments in Romans 5 through 8 does he make the argument that under law means shut up under the inability to keep it? See, again, what I'm doing here is I'm trying to get us all to focus on context. Romans 5 through 8. Paul never, my point is not that people can keep the law 100%. That's not my point. The point is we need to get our theology from the text And so my argument here is this: where in Paul's arguments in Romans 5 through 8 does he make the argument that under law means shut up under the ability to keep it? Okay, it's just not there. Okay, it is not there. That's another big hint to you, telling you that under law doesn't mean covenant of works as these two theologians have defined it. Hodges makes this argument in Galatians 3. Paul makes this argument. So Paul actually gets close to this idea of covenant of works as far as the inability of everyone to keep it. The inability of people to keep it. He gets close. He does get close to that, but it's over in Galatians. It's not in Romans 5 through 8. So Paul makes a similar argument in Galatians 3:10. He says, for all who rely on the works of the law are under a curse. So what he's doing is he's coming against the Judaizers, and he's saying, okay, you guys, since you are the ones who want to rely on works for your salvation, he said, you want to know something? He said, everyone who relies on works of the law are under a curse. And he said, here's the reason why. The reason why is because the scripture says, curse is everyone who does not abide by all the things written in the book of the law to do them. So Paul's point is this: if you want to be under the law as a basis of your salvation, you're under a curse, dude, because you know why? You've already sinned at least once, and you're going to sin more. In other words, you haven't kept it perfectly. And if you want to be justified by your works, you have to keep all of the law, okay? And so, but that argument, this is in Galatians 3:10. So my point is this: if under law meant to be shut up under the inability to keep the whole law, what I'm saying is that Paul mentions this in Galatians 3:10. Well, if under law meant that, how come Paul didn't use this Galatians 3:10 argument in Romans chapter 5 through 8? Wouldn't that have been a great place to mention it, right? I mean, if Paul was teaching that under law meant under a covenant of works, in a sense that you can't keep all of it, right? And so you can't you're going to lose your salvation because you can't keep it 100%. Would it not have made sense for Paul to take what he wrote in Galatians 3:10 and put it within the context of Romans 5 through 8 so that we could see the connection between that and under law? But he didn't do it. Okay. This also from David Brown. This is the same thing. So here's my next point. My point is that Paul's argument is not that we can't keep it. Again, as I said, if you look through Romans 5 through 8, you will search in vain for Paul making any argument that we can't keep the law. Okay? And my point is not that we can keep it 100%. That's not the point. The point is that it's not Paul's argument. And so if we're going to interpret what under law means, we need to take that from out of the text. Okay? So there are 0 verses in Romans 5 through 8 saying we can't keep the law. But guess what? His argument is that the law provokes sin. And we find lots of verses about that. Romans 5:20 to 21, Romans 7:5, Romans 7:7 through 13, and Romans 7:14 through 25. All of those verses are talking about the sin-provoking function of the law. I wonder if under law has something to do with its sin function. Well, we'll have to wait to teaching number 9 to figure that out. Here's reason number 3, and we'll wrap it up. I'm going to give it the "for sin shall not have dominion over you" test. This is our big test for everything right here. We're going to end all of them with the "for sin shall not have dominion over you" test. So whatever under law means, it must explain, whatever under law means, it must explain why being under it is connected to sin's dominion, right? Because look, he says, Because what Paul said in Romans 6:14 is, for sin shall not have dominion over you. Why? Two things. Number one, you're not under law. And number two, you're under grace. We understand the under grace part. God's going to provide grace. But what does under law mean? Well, whatever it means, it has to explain why being under it is connected to sin's dominion. In other words, whatever Paul means by under the law, it must be something that promotes, strengthens, or facilitates the dominion of sin in a person's life. That's why when you're no longer under it, that's the reason why when you're no longer under it, sin is not going to have dominion over you, because in some kind of way, the law was promoting sin within you. Okay. So therefore, whatever under law means, it must explain why being under it is connected to sin's dominion. Now, Hodges argues that Paul's teaching in Romans and Galatians assumes a universal principle. And this is the principle that he's basing his teaching on. He said that they say that the law requires perfect obedience, and that the believer is transferred from this particular law principle. Okay, so this is the principle. In other words, he's saying that the reason why sin has dominion over people is because of this principle. The law requires perfect obedience. So because the law requires perfect obedience, that's why a person is under sin's dominion. And therefore, he says, when you're taken, when the law no longer requires perfect obedience, if God takes that principle away, then you can be set free from sin. But let me just say this. If people were no longer required to keep all of the law 100% perfectly, would they then not be under the dominion of sin? Just think about that. Okay. So let's say it's true. Okay. The law requires perfect obedience. Okay. So let's say that the law didn't require perfect obedience. Does that meet the for sin shall not have dominion over you test? Are people all of a sudden going to be delivered from sin, and sin's not going to have dominion over them because the law doesn't require 100% obedience? All right, here we go. Last slide. If we only have two choices as to what under law means, right? Let's simplify this for this test. We only have two choices about what under law means. Choice A, under law means under the requirement of 100% obedience. That's the covenant of works paradigm, okay? That's one paradigm, okay? It means 100% requirements. And B, supposing under the law means under the law's ability to cause offenses and sins to abound in your life. Romans 5:20 through 21, 7:5, 7:7 through 13, and 7:14 through 25. If we only have those two choices, I'm going to ask you a question. Now you tell me which remedy would be the best remedy to ensure that sin no longer has dominion over you. Choice A, the requirement of 100% obedience is removed from you. Or choice B, the law no longer functions to provoke sin in your life. Which one of those makes more sense? I rest my case.